It was a quiet morning in David's suburban neighborhood, the sun creeping lazily over the horizon, casting long shadows across the rows of identical houses. Birds chirped from nearby trees, and the air was thick with the promise of a calm day. But for David, it was anything but calm. As he sipped his coffee, still groggy from a restless night, he spotted it, the yellow slip wedged into his mailbox. It was unmistakable. The bold black letters emblazoned across the top read, HOA notice. His stomach sank like a stone, the warmth of his coffee now a bitter taste in his mouth. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing it was coming, but the reality hit him hard. He reluctantly slid the letter from its envelope and began reading. Dear Mr. Stevens, we are writing to inform you that your property is currently out of compliance with the Homeowners Association's established guidelines. The exterior paint of your home has faded and is in need of repainting within the next 2 weeks. Please ensure that the new color meets the standards outlined in the community bylaws. Failure to comply will result in a fine. Thank you for your cooperation. The Board of the Suburban Heights HOA. David blinked, his eyes narrowing as he reread the words. Out of compliance. It sounded like a crime. His home, a modest 2-story with a faded shade of top, had been fine for years. In fact, it had always fit in seamlessly with the neighborhood. Yet now, according to the HOA, it was no longer acceptable. The color of his house wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was a violation. And the worst part, they were giving him an ultimatum: repaint it or pay the price. He could feel the blood rising to his cheeks, a hot flush of anger spreading from his chest to his face. This was the final straw. The HOA had been a thorn in his side for as long as he had lived here. Petty rules, ridiculous fines, and demands that were more about control than anything else. They had already told him to trim his hedges, cut back his tree branches, and keep his lawn a certain shade of green. All the while, they had painted a picture of the perfect, pristine community, where every house was indistinguishable from the next. David glanced out the window, staring at his neighbors' homes. Perfectly manicured lawns, bland beige walls, and roofs that seemed to blend into each other like a boring sea of conformity. Was this what life was supposed to be? He had lived here for over 5 years, and each year, the community felt less like a place to call home, and more like a prison built of rules, of expectations, of people who thought they had the right to tell him how to live. The letter dangled from his fingers as his mind raced. I could repaint it, sure, but what if I didn't? What if I gave them something they'd never forget? His pulse quickened at the thought. A surge of rebellious energy coursed through him. There was something deeply satisfying in the idea of challenging the authority that had always loomed over him like a shadow. This was his moment. If the HOA wanted him to repaint his house, he would paint it, but he wouldn't do it their way. He would paint it something they couldn't ignore. Something so bold, so garish, that it would force them to rethink their rules. David's gaze shifted back to his house. He could already see it in his mind's eye. The transformation. No more dull beige. No more compliance. This was going to be something else entirely. He could already hear the gasps of his neighbors as they caught sight of his rebellious creation. The HOA would come, of course. They'd demand he change it back. But what if he didn't? What if he stood firm? He grabbed his phone and quickly Googled most shocking paint colors for houses. His fingers trembled slightly with anticipation as he scrolled. Then he saw it. The color that made his heart race. Neon green. It was eye-popping, almost radioactive in its intensity. It was a color that didn't just stand out. It screamed for attention. His mind spun with possibilities. Yes, this is it. This is the one. The decision was made. No more beige. No more conformity. He would paint his house in a color so bright, so outrageous, that the HOA would have no choice but to acknowledge his defiance. Let them come, he thought, his lips curling into a smirk. Let them try to stop me. As he stood there, Holding the letter in his hands, David felt a sense of power he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't just a homeowner anymore. He was an artist. And this was his canvas. David couldn't sleep that night. The yellow slip from the HOA kept replaying in his mind, each word, each demand reverberating like an echo in his skull. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This was it. The moment for change had arrived. The moment he could finally fight back. He had been pushed to the edge for too long by a group of people who thought they could control every inch of his life. As the clock ticked into the late hours of the night, David sat at his kitchen table, scrolling on his phone, the screen lighting up his face in the dark. His fingers danced across the screen, searching for the most outrageous color possible, something that would stop people dead in their tracks, something that would make the HOA regret ever stepping foot in his life. His search led him through endless images of painted houses, each more ridiculous than the last. Some were bold, others quirky, but nothing seemed quite right. He needed something that would be impossible to ignore. As his thumb swiped past row after row of colors, one image caught his eye. A house drenched in a sickly, yet mesmerizing, neon green. It was almost electric in its intensity, a color that seemed to hum, that vibrated with a pulse of its own. David froze. This was it. The neon green wasn't just a color. It was an event. He could already imagine it. His house glowing in the dark, practically glowing with defiance. The HOA would lose their minds. The neighbors, they wouldn't know what hit them. A single glance would be enough to stop them in their tracks. It would haunt them. It would linger in their memories. The idea sent a jolt of excitement through David. He leaned back in his chair, grinning. This is it, he thought again, the weight of it settling into his chest, like a secret he couldn't wait to reveal. He was no longer a simple homeowner following the rules. He was a force. And this house would be his weapon. Before he knew it, his phone was already ringing with a text message from a friend, Sam, who lived 2 blocks down. Dude, is it true? I heard you're going full wild on the house. What's the plan? David's fingers flew across the keyboard as he replied, You'll see soon enough. Get ready. The excitement bubbled over, but there was still the matter of obtaining the paint. Neon green wasn't exactly a popular choice for suburban homes. A quick call to a local hardware store confirmed that they did, indeed, have the color in stock. The man on the other end of the line barely concealed his amusement when David mentioned the color. Sure thing, buddy. We can mix that for you. You'll be hard to miss. The employee chuckled, his tone thick with skepticism. David's heart pounded in his chest as he hung up. The universe had conspired to bring him here, to this exact moment. All the pieces were falling into place. Now, all that was left to do was execute the plan. The next morning, he arrived at the hardware store, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The first rays of light cut through the air, as if to mark the beginning of something extraordinary. David walked through the store's aisle with purpose, eyes scanning the shelves until he found it. An entire shelf of cans, ready to be filled with the electric shade he had chosen. Can I help you with something, sir? A voice interrupted his thoughts, and David turned to face the sales associate who had approached him. He smiled at the sight of the neon green paint. I'm going to need about 5 gallons of that, he said, pointing toward the shelf. The associate raised an eyebrow. 5 gallons. You sure about that? That's gonna be a lot of green. David grinned. Yeah, I'm sure. I've got a house that needs to be seen. The associate gave a quick, uncertain nod before he moved to prepare the paint. As David watched the man work, he felt a rush of adrenaline, the anticipation building with every moment. His house was about to become a spectacle, something so vibrant, so eye-popping, that it would forever change the neighborhood. By noon, he was back at home, his car loaded with the gallons of paint. As he unloaded the supplies, he looked up at his house, standing there in its dull, faded beige. It was ordinary. It was forgettable, but not for long. He set to work immediately, the first stroke of the brush hitting the wall with a satisfying splash. The neon green paint spread like wildfire across the exterior, the bold streaks seeming to burn through the beige like fire through paper. Each brushstroke was an act of defiance, an act of freedom. With every inch of green that covered the dull surface, David felt lighter, bolder. As the hours passed, his mind raced ahead of the physical work. He could already hear the whispers of the neighbors, see their horrified faces when they saw what he had done. His hands moved faster now, the paint transforming the house with a life of its own. The house was no longer just a building. It was a statement. By the time the sun began to set, the house was nearly done. David stood back, breathing in the sweet scent of fresh paint. The sight before him was nothing short of a spectacle. The vibrant, electrifying neon green gleamed in the fading sunlight, a beacon of rebellion against the conformity that had always weighed him down. But as he stood there, taking it all in, a thought crept into his mind. What would the neighbors think? He looked around at the houses that bordered his property, all calm, all beige and brown. He could feel the tension building already, the first wave of judgment ready to crash over him. But instead of fear, excitement gripped him. This was the moment. Let them stare. Let them talk. This wasn't just about paint. It was about freedom. David stood in the front yard, staring at his house. The bright neon green paint in the cans before him seemed almost too bold, too shocking for the sleepy suburban neighborhood. But that's exactly why it was perfect. His heart raced with anticipation. This is it. No turning back now. As the sun dipped lower, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood, David uncapped the first gallon. The thick, glossy paint shimmered in the light, almost vibrating with the intensity of its color. He dipped the brush into the paint, feeling the weight of it in his hand. One stroke. That's all it would take to start transforming his home from an ordinary beige shell into a bold statement. The brush hovered above the wall for a moment, a beat of hesitation, before David plunged it into the surface with a swift, confident stroke. The neon green spread across the dull beige with stunning speed. It was like watching a wildfire tear through dry grass. Bright, fast, and impossible to ignore. The contrast was staggering. His house was no longer a passive part of the neighborhood. It was alive, radiating energy and defiance in every inch of the wall. David stepped back, his breath catching in his throat as he took in the sight. The neon paint didn't just sit on the surface. It pulsed with life, almost glowing in the fading sunlight. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop, as if holding its breath at the sheer audacity of what he was doing. But then, the reality of it hit him. The neighbors would see. They would notice. And they would have questions. With renewed determination, David continued, each stroke of the brush spreading the electric color further, overtaking the once boring beige. As he worked, his thoughts buzzed with excitement. What would the HOA think when they saw it? Would they send a complaint? Would they fine him for breaking their precious color rules? He couldn't wait to find out. The sun had set completely now, leaving only the soft glow of streetlights to illuminate his progress. David moved in a frenzy, eager to finish before the neighbors had a chance to take notice. But as he worked, something began to change. He could feel eyes on him. It started subtly, at first, just a few curious glances from the windows of neighboring houses. Then, more than just glances. He could hear whispers, muffled voices behind curtains, the sound of footsteps moving cautiously toward their windows. He couldn't help but smile. Let them wash. A woman from 2 houses down appeared on her porch, standing just at the edge of her lawn, hands on her hips. She was staring at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. David caught her gaze, and without missing a beat, waved enthusiastically. She didn't wave back. The tension in the air thickened, almost tangible. The feeling was electric. It was as though the neighborhood had collectively held its breath, waiting for something to happen. David's movements grew faster, more deliberate. As the first coat of paint dried, he applied a second, knowing full well that this wasn't just about color. It was about making an impact. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence of his concentration. He pulled it out, seeing a text from his friend Sam. "You really doing this?" David's lips twitched into a grin. He quickly typed back, "You'll see soon enough. Get ready." The night crept on, and soon the house was almost completely coated in neon green. The once nuded structure was now a blazing monument of rebellion. Even in the dark, it stood out like a beacon against the sleepy rows of beige houses that surrounded it. But as David finished the final strokes, something unexpected happened. From the corner of his eye, he saw a figure approaching. A man, walking quickly down the street, his steps deliberate. David recognized him immediately. It was Mr. Thompson, the HOA representative. David's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected them to show up so soon. Mr. Thompson stopped at the edge of the yard, his arms folded across his chest. His face was unreadable, but David could see the shock in his eyes as he took in the sight of the house. He stood there, silent for what felt like an eternity, before finally speaking. "You're really going to make me do this, aren't you?" Mr. Thompson's voice was low, almost resigned. His eyes flicked to the house, then back to David, a mix of disbelief and frustration in his gaze. David grinned, his pulse quickening. This is what he wanted. "Yep, I'm really going to make you do this." He took a step forward, meeting the HOA representative's gaze without flinching. "I'm not going to follow your rules anymore. Not this time." Mr. Thompson's face reddened. "You're in violation of every regulation we've got. You're going to have to repaint this, or there will be consequences." David stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest, the thrill of rebellion surging through him. Let them come, he thought. Let them try to stop me. As Mr. Thompson turned to leave, muttering something about fines and complaints, David felt a rush of exhilaration. This was just the beginning. But as the darkness enveloped the neighborhood, a question lingered in the back of David's mind. What would the neighbors think? Would they stand with him or against him? His gaze swept over the houses, the once familiar, quiet community now suddenly charged with tension. This wasn't just about color anymore. It was about making a statement. And it was about to get much, much bigger. The next morning, David awoke to the sound of whispers. The sun had barely risen, but the energy around him was anything but still. As he stretched and stumbled to the window, his eyes were immediately drawn to the street below. His heart skipped a beat. Every window across the block seemed to be alive with activity, faces peering out, watching his house with wide eyes. Some were on their porches, hands on hips, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others were standing in their driveways, their mouths agape as they took in the sight of his vibrant, electric greenhouse. David leaned back, letting out a small laugh, his fingers still wrapped around his coffee mug. They're all awake now. They've seen it. He knew he had them hooked. The silence that hung in the air was thick with something almost tangible: suspicion, anger, confusion. They'd never seen anything like this before. He took a sip of his coffee, savoring the bitterness, his mind already racing. The HOA had made their move. Now it was time for the neighborhood to respond. And judging by the shocked faces he had seen earlier, the response would be far from pleasant. Minutes later, a knock echoed at his front door. David's heart raced. He didn't have to guess who it was. He had known it was only a matter of time before they came. He set the coffee cup down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and took a deep breath before opening the door. Standing in front of him was Mrs. Lawson, the elderly woman from across the street, her hands shaking as she clutched a piece of paper. Her once groomed hair, now frazzled, stuck out in wild tufts. She was staring at his house as though it had somehow offended her very existence. She blinked several times, trying to process what her eyes were seeing. Finally, she looked back at him, her voice trembling. "David, what have you done?" she asked, her tone a mixture of horror and confusion. David tried not to smile. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Lawson. It's just a little paint. Pretty nice, don't you think? Her eyes darted back to the house, a tremor running through her frail frame. Nice. It's blinding. It's an eyesore. What were you thinking? Her voice rose with every word, the shock turning into anger. David shrugged casually. I was thinking that I was done following all the rules. The house needed a little excitement. Mrs. Lawson took a shaky step back, her face as pale as the concrete sidewalk under her feet. Excitement. This is a neighborhood, not some carnival. People are talking, David. People are whispering. She glanced over her shoulder as though she feared the entire neighborhood might descend upon him. You've made a fool of yourself. David met her gaze, unshaken. I'm not the one who's afraid of a little color. Before she could say anything more, another voice cut through the air. What's going on here? It was Mr. Thompson, the HOA representative, walking briskly up the street toward them. His face was set in a tight frown, his eyes narrowing as they settled on David's freshly painted house. The tension in the air thickened, the silence almost suffocating. David raised an eyebrow as Mr. Thompson approached. Back again, huh? He asked, crossing his arms over his chest. You're in clear violation of the rules, David, Mr. Thompson replied, his voice sharp. We gave you 2 weeks, and this is what you've done. This is a disaster. He flicked a hand toward the house, as though it was an eyesore that was beyond saving. David couldn't help but laugh. This is it. This is what I've been waiting for. Disaster. David echoed, walking a few steps down the porch toward Mr. Thompson, his voice calm but firm. No, Mr. Thompson, this is freedom. This is me refusing to live under the shadow of rules that make no sense. My house is mine. I can paint it any color I want. Mr. Thompson's face twisted in frustration. His jaw clenched as he fought to keep his composure. You have 2 options, David. 1. You repaint it to a neutral color, or 2. We start issuing fines. Big fines. You're in violation of several HOA rules. This travesty, he gestured to the house, will not stand. As Mrs. Lawson stood silently in the background, her face a mix of concern and anger, David felt the satisfaction of taking control of his own fate. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't backing down. The murmurs in the neighborhood were only fueling the fire inside him. Fine me, he said, a devil-may-care smile spreading across his face. I'll gladly pay. But you know what? You'll never get rid of this. Not as long as I live here. This is my home now. The HOA agent opened his mouth, then paused. His eyes flicked over to Mrs. Lawson, who had started to walk away, muttering to herself about the unbearable audacity of it all. Her shoulders were hunched in indignation, the sheer disbelief written across her face. A few more neighbors peeked out from their windows, shaking their heads as they watched the confrontation unfold. Do you really want to go down this road? Mr. Thompson asked, his voice low and almost threatening. David stood tall, unflinching. Yes, I do. With that, the HOA agent turned on his heel, muttering under his breath as he walked back to his car, knowing full well that David was not going to make this easy. David stood there for a moment, letting the words hang in the air, and then turned to look at the house once more. It stood there like a monument, vivid, vibrant, and unyielding. This was only the beginning. The sun had barely set, but the air was already thick with an unsettling tension. It hung like a storm cloud, heavy with the promise of something big, something unavoidable. David couldn't shake the feeling that he had sparked something much larger than he had anticipated. As he stepped back inside, the echoes of the confrontation with Mr. Thompson rang in his ears. Yes, I do. The words felt powerful, like a declaration of war. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no going back now. David tried to focus on the rest of his evening, making dinner, watching the news, but the strange energy in the air was impossible to ignore. Every so often, He would glance out the window to find his neighbors watching. A few of them lingered by their front doors, some with their phones out, others talking in hushed voices. It was like they were waiting for something to happen, something they couldn't quite put into words. The house, his house, was the talk of the entire block. At 9 p.m., the doorbell rang again. David's heart raced, an involuntary rush of adrenaline shooting through him. The knock was fast, urgent. No one ever knocked like this, not in his quiet, predictable neighborhood. He wiped his hands on his pants and walked toward the door, his mind racing with possibilities. Could it be another neighbor? More HOA representatives, or maybe something else entirely. He opened the door to find none other than Mark, the young father who lived next door. Mark's face was a mix of confusion and frustration, his eyes darting nervously toward the bright green monstrosity of a house beside him. David raised an eyebrow, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Mark, what's up?" David asked, trying to sound nonchalant. Mark shifted uncomfortably, wringing his hands together. "David, this has gone too far. The whole street is talking about it. My kids won't stop asking why your house looks like a highlighter. My wife is furious. Do you have any idea what this is doing to the neighborhood?" David blinked, feigning innocence. "What do you mean, Mark? I thought everyone liked it." Mark's brow furrowed, his voice rising in anger. "You really don't get it, do you? This isn't just about paint. You're making us all look bad. You're making us all uncomfortable. You know how much work we put into keeping up with the HOA rules, the rules we all agreed to follow when we moved in here. Now, because of you, people are starting to ask questions, and what are we supposed to say? That we're living next door to this?" He gestured wildly toward the house. David took a deep breath, watching Mark carefully. He could see the frustration in his eyes, the anger that boiled just beneath the surface. But something else was there too, a trace of fear. Fear of being judged. Fear of being singled out. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Mark," David said, his voice even, though his insides churned with excitement. "But this is my house. I paid for it. I don't see why it matters what color I paint it." He stepped back, looking past Mark at the sea of homes stretching down the street. "We all live here, right? So why not let everyone express themselves the way they want to?" Mark's eyes narrowed. "Because it's not just about expression, David. It's about community. This." He paused, looking at the house again, shaking his head. "This is an attack. An attack on what makes this place livable. We all agreed to those rules for a reason." David met his gaze squarely. "Well, maybe I don't agree with those rules anymore." He gestured to the now glowing house. "Maybe I think it's time for a change." Mark opened his mouth as if to say more but stopped, taking a long breath. His shoulders slumped, and for a brief moment, David saw the weight of his neighbor's frustration. "You're pushing it, man. This might be your home, but it's not just about you. You're dragging all of us into this mess. If the HOA gets involved." He stopped himself and shook his head. "Forget it. You do you, but don't expect any of us to back you up." With that, Mark turned and walked away, his shoulders stiff with unresolved tension. David watched him go, the silence settling in again. His words rang in David's ears. "You're dragging all of us into this mess." For a moment, David felt a flicker of doubt, but it was quickly smothered by the exhilaration of what he had done. The rebellion was alive. And it wasn't just about a coat of paint anymore. It was about shaking up the status quo. The invisible lines that had bound him to their suffocating expectations were finally being torn down, one brushstroke at a time. As the night wore on, David's phone buzzed once more. It was another message from Sam. "The HOA's coming tomorrow morning. They're serious now." David smiled at the message, his pulse quickening. The storm was about to break, and he was ready for whatever came next. The neighborhood was divided now, with tensions running high, but David didn't care. He was no longer just the guy who followed the rules. He was a man standing firm, his bright greenhouse daring everyone to take a closer look. The following morning, as the first rays of light broke over the horizon, David's phone rang. It was an unknown number, but he answered anyway. "You've made your choice, Mr. Stevens," the voice on the other end said coldly. "And now we've made ours. Expect to hear from our legal team soon." David's heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't suppress the smile that tugged at his lips. Let the games begin. The next morning, the world felt different. The usual hum of suburban life seemed almost too quiet, as if the air had thickened with the weight of anticipation. David stood in his kitchen, staring out the window at his electric greenhouse, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. The vibrant color was brighter than ever under the daylight, almost surreal in its intensity. "I've done it now," he thought, a sense of excitement welling up inside him. There's no going back. But as much as he reveled in the defiance, a new tension simmered in his veins. His phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was an email notification. He tapped it open, and his heart skipped a beat as he read the subject line. Notice of violation and legal action. David's fingers gripped the edge of the counter as he scrolled through the email. The HOA was serious. They were moving fast. No more warnings, no more threats. They were going straight for legal action. "Dear Mr. Stevens," the email began, "we are writing to inform you that your recent actions regarding the exterior color of your residence have violated several sections of the HOA's bylaws, including color guidelines, exterior decor limitations, and community aesthetic standards. You have been given ample time to comply, yet you have intentionally chosen to disregard the rules that protect the integrity of our neighborhood." The words on the screen blurred together as his pulse quickened. The email went on to threaten fines, penalties, and a potential lawsuit if the paint wasn't changed within 48 hours. It was a full-blown declaration of war. David read the final paragraph again, the text sinking in with cold finality. "If you do not immediately repaint your house to comply with the community standards, we will pursue further legal actions, including a formal complaint to the city, fines of up to $5,000 per day, and the possibility of legal fees and further litigation." A bitter laugh escaped David's lips. He knew this was coming. He had known since the first stroke of paint had touched the wall. "They're desperate," he thought, the fire of rebellion burning brighter. He hit reply and typed a response with quick, decisive strokes. "Thank you for your email. As previously stated, I have no intention of repainting my house to fit your rules. I will be happy to see you in court." He hit send and leaned back, feeling a strange calm settle over him. The battle had begun, and there was no turning back now. The stakes were higher than ever, and David felt alive, like a storm that had just begun to gather force. By mid-afternoon, the storm clouds were starting to gather, but they weren't the only ones preparing for a confrontation. David stepped outside, his feet crunching on the gravel of his driveway. His eyes scanned the street. The neighborhood was on edge. People peeked out from behind curtains, eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Cars drove by a little slower than usual, as if they were all waiting for something to happen. David was no stranger to the quiet hum of gossip that filled the air after a confrontation. But this time, the whispers felt different. They felt darker, sharper, like a sharp breath held just before the exhale. He could almost hear the neighbors' thoughts swirling in the air, each one trying to make sense of his actions. Then, without warning, a car pulled into his driveway. It was a black sedan, sleek and polished, the kind of car you didn't see every day in their suburban enclave. The windows were tinted, and the engine hummed to a stop with an eerie quietness. David watched, his eyes narrowing. A figure in a suit stepped out of the car, tall, confident, and cold. It was a man he didn't recognize, but the briefcase in his hand told David all he needed to know. The man walked toward him, his expression unreadable. He didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "Mr. Stevens," the man asked, his voice smooth but carrying an undertone of authority. "I'm here on behalf of the HOA's legal team. We've received your response to the notice of violation." David's pulse quickened, but he stood tall. "I'm sure you have. And I've made myself clear. I'm not repainting." The man's lips curled into a tight smile, though there was no warmth behind it. "I see. You've made your choice, then." He took a few steps closer, his gaze never leaving David's. "I'm here to inform you that, effective immediately, the HOA will begin the legal process to enforce compliance. You've left us no choice." David crossed his arms over his chest, unwavering. "Do your worst. I'm not afraid of a lawsuit." The man nodded slowly, his eyes cold. "Very well. You'll be hearing from us shortly." With that, he turned and walked back to his car, the click of his shoes on the concrete echoing in the quiet of the street. David watched him go, his mind racing with the sudden weight of the situation. The HOA had brought in the big guns, the legal team. "This is it," he thought. "They're not going to back down, and neither am I." As the man drove off, David stood there, feeling the growing pressure of what lay ahead. But instead of fear, he felt something else, a sense of exhilaration. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And no matter what the HOA threw at him, David knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going down without a fight. The evening air was thick with unease. The buzz of distant voices echoed through the neighborhood, a growing murmur that seemed to swirl around David's electric greenhouse, now a beacon of defiance and controversy. From his window, he could see it, the way the other houses seemed to shrink back in comparison. His house stood like a neon sign in the darkening dusk, daring anyone to look away. David leaned against the windowsill, his heart still racing from the visit earlier that day. The legal team had made their move, but this wasn't over. No, it was just beginning. And already, things were shifting. The neighborhood was at a tipping point. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The HOA's legal threats were made official in the form of letters slid under every door on the street. It wasn't just David who had become the target of their wrath anymore. It was everyone who had allowed this to happen. Every homeowner who had, in the eyes of the HOA, turned a blind eye to the so-called disruption that David's house represented. David sat on his porch, watching the slow parade of neighbors who began to appear one by one. They stood in their yards or by their mailboxes, exchanging glances, murmuring in low voices. Some gave David short nods of acknowledgement, others avoided his gaze altogether, as if they feared even looking at him would make them complicit in the rebellion. His eyes caught a figure emerging from across the street. It was Mrs. Lawson, the elderly woman who had once stormed onto his porch in a fit of outrage. Today, however, her posture was different, less rigid, almost uncertain. She hesitated at the edge of her driveway, her fingers nervously gripping her purse, and then, as though drawn by an invisible force, she crossed the street toward David's house. David didn't move. He simply watched her approach, a part of him curious to see what was going through her mind. When she reached the end of his driveway, she stopped, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. Her voice was low, almost hesitant. "David," she began, her eyes flicking nervously to the vibrant walls of his home, then back to him. I didn't know it would come to this." David smiled, his tone light, but with an edge that only he could feel. "Didn't know what?" "Mrs. Lawson. That a little color might shake things up." Her lips tightened, and she looked back at the sea of houses across the street, where more heads were now peeking from windows and behind curtains. "You've put us all in a terrible position, you know. The HOA is serious. They could destroy this neighborhood with their fines. And the lawsuits." She trailed off, her voice barely a whisper now. "But I've been thinking." David arched an eyebrow, intrigued. "Thinking about what?" Mrs. Lawson hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering her voice further. "I can't say I like the color of your house, but I respect what you're doing. You're making a stand. I think we need to fight back. We're all getting dragged into this, whether we want to or not." Her eyes flicked over her shoulder once more, then back at him, searching his face for some kind of response. "If you need help, I'll stand with you." David's heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Lawson, the same woman who had looked at him with such disgust just days ago, was now offering him her support. It was like a switch had been flipped. Maybe this wasn't just about the paint, he thought. Maybe this was about something much bigger. He smiled, his eyes glinting with determination. "You're not the only one, Mrs. Lawson. There's more of us than you think." That night, David lay awake, his mind swirling with new possibilities. Mrs. Lawson wasn't the only one who was changing her mind. He could sense it, the shift in the air, the crackling tension that had taken over the block. There were others, too, who were starting to see things differently. As more neighbors started to come forward, the divide between those who followed the HOA's rules and those who were ready to break free grew ever wider. The following day, as David made his way to his front door, he was greeted by two more familiar faces: Mark, the young father from next door, and Kevin, a quiet retiree from down the street. Both were standing at the end of his driveway, looking somewhat uncomfortable but resolute. Mark cleared his throat. "We've been talking, David," he said, glancing over at Kevin, who gave a curt nod. "We don't agree with everything you've done, but this is bigger than paint. This is about us having a voice, about not being pushed around by them anymore." Kevin stepped forward. "We've lived here for years, and we've watched them tighten their grip on this neighborhood. It's time someone stood up." David's breath caught in his throat. His pulse began to race. This was it. The neighborhood was dividing right before his eyes, but in a way he hadn't anticipated. It was no longer just him against the HOA. It was them against all of us. "Then let's stand together," David said, his voice a low, confident growl. "The HOA has underestimated what happens when you push people too far, but they're going to learn." A look of resolve passed between them. David could see the fire in their eyes that had once been clouded with doubt, now burning with clarity. As the days passed, the tension only grew. More and more neighbors began to quietly approach David. Some offered support. Others, like Mrs. Lawson, had shifted their views entirely. The HOA had ignited a firestorm, and it was one they hadn't been prepared for. The countdown was on. What had started as a small rebellion, one man's choice to paint his house in defiance, was now a full-scale battle for control of the neighborhood. And David knew one thing for sure: that wouldn't stop until the HOA's grip on their homes was broken forever. The day of reckoning had arrived. It was a day David had known would come, but the reality of it was like a storm cloud that loomed over him, dark and unrelenting. The HOA had scheduled a final meeting with him, a last-ditch effort to force him into compliance before they escalated their legal battle. But today, David wasn't alone. The quiet revolution that had begun with his paintbrush had snowballed into something far more powerful than anyone had anticipated. His house, now fully surrounded by curious onlookers and supporters, was a monument to defiance. Neighbors who had once shied away now stood proudly on their lawns, watching the proceedings from a distance. Some of them had even begun to gather signs in support of David's stand. No more rules raid one, freedom to paint another. The once silent suburban street had transformed into a battlefield of ideas. David stood outside his home, his heart racing as he waited for the HOA's representatives to arrive. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to find a message from Mark. "We're all here. We stand with you." The word sent a jolt of energy through him, fueling his resolve. The sound of an approaching car broke his concentration. A black SUV pulled into the driveway. This time, no lone lawyer stepping out. This time, it was the entire HOA board. 6 well-dressed individuals, stern-faced and intimidating, filed out of the vehicle, each one exuding the kind of power that had once sent David cowering into compliance. But today, they were met with something entirely different. As the HOA representatives stepped onto the sidewalk, David held his ground, not a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. Mr. Thompson, the HOA president, was at the front of the group. His expression was grim, as though he had already prepared himself for an unpleasant confrontation. "Mr. Stevens," he began, his voice as cold as the steel-gray clouds above them, "this has gone on long enough. You've had every opportunity to rectify the situation. We gave you a chance to comply, and you chose to ignore it." David smiled, his eyes gleaming with a mix of defiance and determination. "Did I? Or maybe I chose to fight for something that matters more than your bylaws. You don't own this neighborhood, Mr. Thompson. People live here. They have voices. And today, they've spoken." The HOA board exchanged uneasy glances, but Thompson pressed on. "You're causing irreparable damage to this community. We have the legal right to demand that you restore your home to its original condition. If you refuse, we will be forced to take you to court and pursue damages. We've already made our case." David stepped forward, his posture unwavering. "And what if I don't care about your legal threats? What if the cost of doing what's right is more important than a few fines or lawsuits?" He paused, letting the words sink in. "You want to know what's really happening here? You're losing control. You're losing the power you thought you had." Behind him, the crowd of neighbors shifted, their murmurs rising in volume. The energy was palpable, like the moment before a storm breaks. Thompson took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "This is your final warning, Mr. Stevens. Do the right thing and repaint, or face the consequences." David's gaze hardened. "You don't get it. I already did what I believe is right. And now, I'm not doing it for myself. I'm doing it for all of us." He gestured to the neighbors gathered behind him, standing firm, their faces set in solidarity. "This isn't just about paint. It's about the right to live freely, to make choices without someone breathing down our necks. We don't need your approval anymore." The crowd erupted into applause, a thunderous sound that sent shivers down David's spine. His heart swelled with pride, his conviction stronger than ever. Today, he wasn't just fighting for a coat of paint. He was fighting for the soul of his community. And the people behind him were ready to stand with him, no matter what. Thompson's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with frustration. He glanced at the other board members, who seemed to be second-guessing their position. The balance of power had shifted, and it was clear they hadn't anticipated such fierce resistance. Without another word, Thompson turned on his heel, the rest of the board following in his wake. "We'll see you in court," he muttered, his voice bitter, before they all climbed back into the SUV and drove off, their defeat unmistakable. David stood there, a mixture of exhilaration and relief washing over him. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. But today, he had won. And he had done it on his terms, with the support of his neighbors, his friends, his community. As the sun set over the street, casting long shadows on the pavement, David couldn't help but smile. He had taken a stand, and in doing so, he had united a divided neighborhood. The HOA had underestimated the power of people who were no longer willing to be silenced, no longer willing to conform to the rules of an outdated system. And as the crowd dispersed, some laughing, others shaking their heads in disbelief, David knew one thing for sure: change had come to the neighborhood. And it had come in the most unexpected, most brilliant way possible.